My mother and I have the same birthday, March 7, 1996. We always joked that it was fate, that the universe had given us this special connection, that sharing a birthday meant we were destined to share everything else too. I believed that story for 28 years. Then I took a DNA test, and I discovered that the woman who raised me wasn't my mother at all. She was a stranger who had taken me from a hospital nursery and raised me as her own, while my real mother spent nearly 3 decades searching for the daughter who had been stolen from her. My name is Ellery, and for 28 years I believed I was the biological daughter of Susan and Michael Porter. I had their last name, their family stories, their holiday traditions, their expectations for my future. I called Susan Mom and Michael Dad, and never once questioned whether those words meant what I thought they meant. Why would I? I had a birth certificate with their names on it. I had baby photos in a hospital bassinet. I had a childhood filled with birthday cakes and bedtime stories, and all the ordinary moments that make up an ordinary family life. The only thing I didn't have was their DNA. And I didn't discover that until the day I spit into a plastic tube and mailed it to a company that promised to tell me about my ancestry. The DNA test was supposed to be fun. My coworker had done one and discovered she was part Scandinavian, which explained her blonde hair and her inexplicable craving for pickled herring. My boyfriend had found distant cousins in Ireland and was planning a trip to meet them. Everyone was doing these tests, sharing their results on social media, building family trees that stretched back generations. I wanted to be part of the trend. I wanted to know if I was Italian like my father always claimed, or if there was some exotic ancestry hiding in my genes that would make for an interesting story at parties. I ordered the kit on a Tuesday, mailed it back on a Friday, and forgot about it for 6 weeks while I lived my normal life in my normal apartment with my normal understanding of who I was and where I came from. The results arrived on October 3, 2024. I opened the email during my lunch break, expecting to see a colorful pie chart showing percentages of European ancestry, with maybe a surprise sliver of something unexpected. Instead, I saw a notification that made my sandwich turn to cement in my stomach. Close family match found. Possible parent. Below that was a name I had never seen before. Margaret Reyes Thornton. And below that was a message she had sent through the platform 6 hours earlier. I've been looking for you for 28 years. I think you might be my daughter, Elena. Please respond. Please. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I sat at my desk with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, reading those 3 sentences over and over again, trying to make them mean something other than what they obviously meant. A glitch in the system. A scam artist. A confused old woman who had mistaken me for someone else. I ran through every possible explanation except the one that was staring me in the face. That the DNA test was right, that this stranger was my biological mother, that the woman I had called Mom for 28 years was not related to me at all. That explanation was impossible. That explanation would mean my entire life was a lie. So I closed my laptop, threw away my sandwich, and went back to work pretending that I hadn't just received a message that would eventually unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. I lasted 4 days before I responded. 4 days of lying awake at night. 4 days of staring at my mother's face across the dinner table, looking for resemblances I had always assumed were there but suddenly couldn't find. 4 days of Googling DNA test wrong, and false positive ancestry test, and can hospitals switch babies, with increasingly desperate search terms. The internet told me that DNA tests were accurate 99.9% of the time. The internet told me that hospital baby switches, while rare, had happened throughout history and continued to happen even with modern identification systems. The internet told me that the first step was to take another test to confirm the results. But I didn't need another test. Deep down in the place where truth lives beneath denial, I already knew. The woman named Margaret Reyes Thornton was my biological mother. And Susan Porter, the woman who had raised me, was not. My message to Margaret was 3 sentences long. I received your message. I don't understand what's happening. Can we talk? Her response came within 20 minutes, as if she had been sitting by her computer waiting for me to reach out. She gave me her phone number. She said she would be available anytime, day or night, whenever I was ready. She said she had been waiting for this moment for 28 years and she could wait a little longer if I needed time. The patience in her words made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. This was not how a scam artist wrote. This was not how a confused stranger wrote. This was how a mother wrote. A mother who had lost her child and never stopped hoping she would find her again. I called her on October 8, 2024, 5 days after the test results arrived. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. She answered on the first ring. And when she said hello, I heard something crack in her voice, like she was already crying before I even spoke. I told her my name was Ellery. She said she knew that she had already looked me up, that she had seen my photos on social media and recognized something in my face that she had been searching for since 1996. She told me that her daughter had been born on March 7, 1996, at St. Catherine's Hospital in Riverside, California. She told me that her daughter had been named Elena Margaret Reyes after her grandmother. She told me that on the third day after giving birth, she had woken up from a nap to find the wrong baby in her bassinet, and that by the time anyone believed her, it was too late to fix what had been done. The story came out in fragments over the next 2 hours. Margaret had been 24 years old when she gave birth to me, married to a man named Thomas Thornton who worked as an electrician and adored her more than anything in the world. The pregnancy had been difficult, the labor even more so, and by the time I arrived she was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. She remembered holding me for the first time. She remembered counting my fingers and toes. She remembered the small birthmark on my left shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon, that she had traced with her finger while I slept. She remembered falling asleep on the second night with me in the bassinet beside her bed, and waking up on the third morning to find a different baby in that bassinet. A baby without the birthmark. A baby whose face was subtly different in ways she couldn't articulate but knew in her bones were wrong. She had told the nurses immediately. She had told them the baby in the bassinet was not her daughter. They had smiled and patted her hand and told her that all newborns looked alike, that she was tired, that the hormones were playing tricks on her mind. She had escalated to the doctors, to the hospital administration, to anyone who would listen. They had shown her the identification bracelet on the baby's wrist, matching the one on her own wrist, and asked her how she could doubt such clear evidence. They had suggested she might be experiencing postpartum psychosis. They had recommended a psychiatric evaluation. And her husband, her beloved Thomas, who had always believed in her, had started to look at her with concern and confusion, wondering if maybe the doctors were right, if maybe his wife was losing her grip on reality in the wake of childbirth. Margaret had taken the baby home because she had no other choice. But she had never stopped knowing that the child in her arms was not the child she had given birth to. The woman I grew up calling Mom, Susan Porter, had also given birth at St. Catherine's Hospital on March 7, 1996. Her daughter had been born 3 hours before me, in the room next to Margaret's, delivered by the same on-call obstetrician. Susan had named her daughter Ashley. Susan had taken her daughter home on the same day Margaret took home a baby she knew wasn't hers. And for the next 28 years, Susan raised me as Ellery Porter while Margaret raised the real Ashley as Elena Thornton, each mother living with a daughter who didn't share her DNA, one of them knowing the truth and the other completely unaware that anything was wrong. I didn't want to believe that my mother had known. I didn't want to believe that the woman who had packed my school lunches and attended my dance recitals and cried at my high school graduation had been lying to me from the moment she brought me home from the hospital. But Margaret's story had details that demanded investigation. The birthmark on my left shoulder blade, the one shaped like a crescent moon. I had been self-conscious about it as a teenager, had considered having it removed, had asked my mother once why I had it when neither she nor my father had any similar marks. She had told me it was a random genetic quirk, that sometimes these things happened, that it made me unique and special. She had not told me that another woman had noticed the same birthmark missing from the baby she was given, had used it as evidence that a switch had occurred, had begged anyone who would listen to check the other babies born that day for a crescent moon that would prove her right. I confronted Susan Porter on October 15, 2024, 12 days after the DNA results arrived and 7 days after my first conversation with Margaret. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon, the same house where I had grown up, the same living room where I had opened Christmas presents and watched movies with my family, and felt safe and loved and certain of my place in the world. My father was at the golf course, which was intentional. I wanted to speak to my mother alone. I wanted to see her face when I asked her the question that had been burning in my chest for almost 2 weeks. I wanted to know if she would lie to me again. She knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. I could see it in the way her smile faltered, the way her eyes searched my face for clues, the way she offered me coffee and cookies with a brightness that felt forced. I sat down at the kitchen table where I had eaten 1,000 family dinners and I asked her very calmly if she knew that I wasn't her biological daughter. I watched her face go through a transformation I will never forget. Shock, then fear, then something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment for 28 years and was finally free of the weight of her secret. She didn't deny it. She didn't pretend to be confused. She just sat down across from me, put her face in her hands and started to cry. The confession came out slowly, between sobs and apologies and desperate attempts to make me understand. Susan had known from the first week that I wasn't her biological daughter. She had known because a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital had told her. A nurse named Patricia Vance who had been on duty the night of the switch and had witnessed what really happened. The switch hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate. Patricia Vance had taken me from Margaret's bassinet and placed me in Susan's because Susan had paid her $15,000 to do it. Susan Porter had bought me like merchandise. Susan Porter had stolen me from a sleeping mother and spent the next 28 years pretending I was hers. I couldn't breathe. The kitchen that had felt so familiar suddenly felt foreign, like I had never been there before. Like the walls and cabinets and family photos were props in a play I hadn't known I was performing in. I asked her why. I asked her how she could do something so monstrous. I asked her if my father knew, if the whole family knew, if everyone I loved had been complicit in the theft of my identity. The answers came between more sobs, more apologies, more explanations that explained nothing. Susan had given birth to a baby with severe health problems, a heart defect that the doctors said would require multiple surgeries and might not be survivable. The baby had died on March 9, 1996, 2 days after birth. Susan had been devastated, broken, unable to accept that the child she had carried for 9 months was gone. And Patricia Vance, a nurse who had gambling debts and a willingness to bend rules for the right price, had offered her a solution. There was another baby on the ward. A healthy baby with no defects. A baby whose mother was young and overwhelmed and probably wouldn't be able to provide the life the baby deserved. Patricia could make the switch. Patricia could give Susan a living daughter to replace the one she had lost. All it would cost was $15,000 and a willingness to never speak of it again. The birth certificate was forged. The hospital records were altered. Baby Ashley Porter, who had died of a congenital heart defect on March 9, 1996, was officially recorded as having survived and been discharged with her parents. Baby Elena Reyes Thornton, who was healthy and perfect and sleeping peacefully in a bassinet, was officially recorded as having been taken home by her mother and father. The paperwork matched, the bracelets matched the system, and nobody asked questions because there was no reason to ask questions. Except Margaret. Margaret had asked questions. Margaret had screamed and pleaded and demanded investigations. But the evidence was against her, the authorities didn't believe her, and eventually her own husband had committed her to a psychiatric facility for 3 weeks because he was convinced she had lost her mind. By the time she was released, the trail had gone cold. The nurse who had orchestrated the switch had quit her job and moved to another state. The hospital had closed ranks and denied any wrongdoing. And I was being raised in a house 45 minutes away by a woman who had paid to steal me from the mother, who was still looking for me. The weight of what Susan had done crushed me in that kitchen. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a hospital error that could be blamed on negligence or coincidence. This was premeditated theft of a human being. This was a conspiracy between a desperate woman and a corrupt nurse to steal a healthy baby to replace a dead one. This was fraud and identity theft and kidnapping. Crimes that had no statute of limitations because they had continued every single day for 28 years. Every birthday party Susan threw for me was evidence of her crime. Every family photo was a document of her lies. Every "I love you" was spoken by a woman who had built our entire relationship on the foundation of something she stole from someone else. I left the house without saying goodbye. I drove to a parking lot and sat in my car for 2 hours, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except stare at the steering wheel and try to process the magnitude of what I had learned. The woman who raised me was not my mother. She was my kidnapper. The life I had lived was not my life. It was a life that belonged to Ashley Porter. The baby who had died 2 days after birth and been erased so completely that no one even knew to mourn her. I had been given Ashley's name, Ashley's identity, Ashley's place in a family that had no biological connection to me. And somewhere, 45 minutes away, a woman named Margaret had spent 28 years mourning a daughter who wasn't dead, who was just living under a different name with different people who had no right to claim her. I met Margaret Reyes Thornton in person for the first time on October 20, 2024. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our homes, neutral territory for a reunion that neither of us knew how to navigate. I recognized her immediately when she walked in. Not because she looked like me, but because she was looking for me with an intensity that made everything else in the room fade away. She was in her early 50s now, with gray streaking through dark hair that matched mine, with eyes the same deep brown, with hands that trembled when she reached for me. We stood in the middle of that coffee shop holding each other while strangers stared and the baristas pretended not to notice. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Long enough for her tears to soak through my shirt. Long enough for me to understand that I had found something I didn't know I was missing. The story Margaret told me that day filled in gaps I hadn't known existed. After the switch, after her hospitalization, after Thomas started to look at her like she was fragile and dangerous, their marriage had begun to fall apart. They had tried to make it work, had raised Elena together, had built a life that looked normal from the outside. But Margaret had never stopped knowing that Elena wasn't her biological daughter, and that knowledge had poisoned everything. She had loved Elena, of course. She had raised her and protected her and given her everything a mother should give. But she had also grieved for me every single day, mourned for the daughter who had been taken from her, carried a wound that couldn't heal because the person who caused it was still out there living a life that should have been different. Thomas had died in 2015, a heart attack at 54, still believing that his wife's certainty about the switch was a delusion rather than a truth he couldn't accept. Elena was 28 years old now, the same age as me, living in Portland and working as a graphic designer. She had grown up knowing something was different about her relationship with her mother, sensing the grief that Margaret carried even when she smiled, wondering why family photos seemed to make her mother sad instead of happy. Margaret had told her the truth 5 years ago, when Elena was 23, and their relationship had nearly collapsed under the weight of it. Elena had accused Margaret of never truly loving her, of seeing her as a constant reminder of trauma, of treating her as a placeholder for a daughter she actually wanted. They had spent 2 years in family therapy rebuilding what the truth had damaged. They were closer now, Margaret said. Closer than they had ever been because the lies were finally gone. But there was still pain there, still a wound that would never fully heal, still the knowledge that Elena had been raised by a mother who loved her but also mourned someone else every day of her life. I didn't know what to do with my anger. It lived in my chest like a physical thing, hot and heavy and demanding release. I was angry at Susan for stealing me. I was angry at Patricia Vance for selling me. I was angry at the hospital for failing to investigate. I was angry at the system that had made Margaret seem crazy when she was actually the only one telling the truth. I was angry at my father, Michael Porter, who Susan claimed had never known but who I couldn't quite believe was innocent. I was angry at the universe for giving me 28 years of lies instead of 28 years of truth. And underneath all that anger, I was angry at myself for not knowing, for not sensing that something was wrong, for looking at Susan's face my entire life and never once recognizing that we shared nothing except an address. The investigation that followed my discovery revealed the full scope of what had been done. Patricia Vance was still alive, living in Arizona under a different name, working at a nursing home that had no idea about her history. A private investigator I hired tracked her down within 3 weeks, and my lawyer sent her a letter explaining that we knew what she had done and were prepared to pursue legal action. She responded through her own lawyer, denying everything at first, then gradually changing her story as evidence mounted. The $15,000 payment had been made in cash, impossible to trace after nearly 3 decades, but Patricia had kept records. She had kept records of everything, hidden in a safety deposit box, insurance against the possibility that Susan might one day decide to silence the only witness to her crime. There were notes about the switch, dates and times and details that matched Margaret's story exactly. There was even a Polaroid photo of me in my hospital bassinet, taken hours before the switch, with a handwritten note on the back. Elena Reyes Thornton, March 7, 1996, 4:47 p.m. The legal case against Susan Porter was complicated by the passage of time. Criminal kidnapping charges were discussed but ultimately not filed because the district attorney decided the case was too old and too difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Civil suits were another matter. Margaret filed a lawsuit against Susan for intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. I filed a separate suit for identity fraud and damages related to the theft of my biological heritage. The hospital, though no longer operating under the same ownership, was named as a third defendant for negligence in failing to prevent the switch and failing to investigate Margaret's claims. Patricia Vance was offered immunity in exchange for her testimony, a deal that made me sick but that my lawyer assured me was necessary to build the strongest possible case. Susan Porter did not handle the exposure well. When the lawsuits were filed and the story began to leak to local media, she attempted suicide. She survived, barely, and was hospitalized for 2 weeks before being transferred to a psychiatric facility. My father filed for divorce while she was still in treatment. He claimed he had never known the truth, that Susan had deceived him as thoroughly as she had deceived me, that he was as much a victim as anyone. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him because the alternative meant losing both parents at once. But there were small things that didn't add up. The way he had never pushed for me to meet Susan's family, who lived across the country and had never visited. The way he had discouraged me from doing ancestry research in college, saying it was a waste of money. The way he had looked at me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, with an expression I now recognized as guilt rather than love. The media attention was overwhelming. Baby Switch Scandal, 28 years of living a stolen life, was the headline that broke the story nationally. Reporters camped outside my apartment. Talk shows called my lawyer daily, offering money for exclusive interviews. True crime podcasts reached out wanting to feature my story. I declined everything at first, wanting to process what had happened privately before making it public. But Margaret convinced me that telling the story might help others, might encourage people to question discrepancies in their own histories, might put pressure on hospitals to implement better identification systems. So I gave one interview to a journalist who had covered similar cases before, and who I trusted to tell the story with accuracy and compassion. That interview became a documentary. That documentary was watched by 11 million people. And among those 11 million people were other victims of hospital switches, other adults who had grown up with a nagging feeling that something was wrong, who finally had language for their suspicions and resources to investigate them. The settlement came through in August 2025, 10 months after I first received those DNA results. The hospital's insurance company paid Margaret $2.3 million for her decades of suffering and the deliberate suppression of her complaints. I received $1.7 million for the theft of my identity, and the psychological trauma of discovering my entire life was based on fraud. Susan Porter, who had liquidated most of her assets in the divorce, was ordered to pay an additional $450,000 in damages, money she didn't have and would probably never be able to pay. The numbers felt both enormous and inadequate. No amount of money could give Margaret back the 28 years she spent missing a daughter who was alive and reachable. No amount of money could give me back a childhood with my biological mother, a relationship with my biological father Thomas who had died 9 years before I learned the truth, a sense of identity that wasn't built on someone else's crime. Elena and I met for the first time in November 2025. My biological not sister, the woman who had been raised by my biological mother while I was raised by her kidnapper. We had spoken on the phone several times before the meeting, careful conversations where we tried to navigate the impossibility of our connection. She had every reason to resent me. I had been the ghost that haunted her childhood, the absent daughter her mother couldn't stop mourning, the reason Elena had always felt like second choice. But when we finally sat down together, I didn't see resentment in her eyes. I saw curiosity. I saw compassion. I saw someone who understood better than anyone else in the world what it felt like to be part of this particular tragedy. We talked for 6 hours that first day. By the end of it, I had something I never expected to gain from this nightmare. A sister. Not by blood but by circumstance. Not by birth but by the shared experience of surviving what had been done to both of us. My relationship with Margaret is still developing. We talk every week, sometimes more. She has photos of me as a newborn, taken in the hospital before the switch, Photos that Susan never had because Susan hadn't given birth to me. I look at those photos and I see myself in a way I never could in my childhood pictures. The same nose. The same chin. The same expression of peaceful sleep that Margaret says I still make when I'm deeply relaxed. She tells me stories about my biological father. About the man Thomas was before grief and confusion destroyed their marriage. She tells me about my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins who have welcomed me into the family with an enthusiasm that sometimes feels overwhelming. I am learning a new history, a new heritage, a new answer to the question of where I come from. It doesn't replace the history I grew up with, but it runs alongside it, a parallel track that was always there but hidden from view. I have not spoken to Susan Porter since the day I confronted her in the kitchen. She has written me letters from the facility where she is now living, letters my lawyer advises me not to read but which I keep in a drawer because throwing them away feels like another kind of erasure. I don't know what she could possibly say that would help. I don't know if there are words in any language for apologizing for stealing someone's entire existence. Part of me wants to visit her, to sit across from her and ask questions that have no good answers. Why me? Why that family? Why did you let me love you for 28 years knowing that every moment was built on a crime? But another part of me, a larger part, knows that those answers wouldn't change anything. Susan took what wasn't hers because she was broken by loss and willing to break someone else to fill the void. Understanding her pain doesn't excuse her choices. Forgiving her wouldn't undo what she did. So I keep the letters unread, and I keep living the life I'm building without her. And I try not to think about the woman who once read me bedtime stories and is now spending her days in a facility that monitors her to make sure she doesn't hurt herself. Michael Porter, the man I called Dad for 28 years, reached out to me 6 months after the truth came out. He wanted to meet, wanted to explain, wanted to maintain some kind of relationship. I agreed to coffee because I wasn't ready to lose both parents entirely. He told me that he genuinely hadn't known about the switch, that Susan had hidden everything from him, that he had believed I was his biological daughter until the day I confronted Susan and he heard the truth at the same time I did. I wanted to believe him. Part of me still wants to believe him. But there were too many small lies over the years, too many moments that only made sense if he had known and chosen to protect the secret. We meet occasionally now, awkward lunches where we talk about nothing important and avoid the subjects that matter most. He's not my father. He was never my father. But he's also not a stranger. And I can't quite figure out where he belongs in the new architecture of my life. The birthmark on my left shoulder blade, the crescent moon that Margaret had looked for on the wrong baby 28 years ago, has become a kind of symbol for me. Proof that I was always meant to be found. Proof that my body carried the truth even when everyone around me was lying. I look at it in the mirror sometimes and think about the 3-day-old infant I once was, sleeping peacefully in a bassinet while a stranger picked me up and carried me to a different life. I couldn't defend myself then. I couldn't speak or fight or choose. But I can choose now. I can choose who to trust and who to love, and how to build a future that isn't defined by someone else's crime. The birthmark reminds me that I survived. The birthmark reminds me that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. It has been 18 months since. It has been 18 months since I spit into a plastic tube expecting to learn about my ancestry, and instead learned that my entire identity was stolen. 18 months of therapy, legal battles, media attention, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding a sense of self that someone else dismantled before I was old enough to remember. I am 29 years old now, living in a new city, working at a hospital where no one knows my story unless I choose to tell them. I have a relationship with my biological mother that grows deeper every month. I have a sister in Elena who understands things about my experience that no one else can understand. I have a future that is finally, for the first time in my life, actually mine. If you are reading this and something about your family story doesn't make sense, I want you to know that the truth is worth finding even when it hurts. I want you to know that DNA tests are accessible and accurate, and capable of revealing secrets that have been hidden for decades. I want you to know that questioning your history isn't disloyal or paranoid or crazy, no matter what anyone tells you. Margaret questioned her history for 28 years and everyone told her she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. She was the only one brave enough to keep telling the truth when the truth was inconvenient for everyone else. Be like Margaret. Trust your instincts. Ask the questions that scare you. The answers might destroy the life you thought you had, but they might also give you the life you were always supposed to live. My name is Ellery. It was also Elena once before a woman with $15,000 and a broken heart decided she had more right to me than the mother who gave me life. I spent 28 years as Ashley Porter's replacement, a living doll meant to fill a dead baby's crib. I spent 28 years loving a kidnapper and missing a mother I didn't know existed. But I am not defined by what was done to me. I am defined by what I do next. And what I do next is live. Fully honestly, with my eyes open and my questions answered and my identity finally irrevocably my own. Susan Porter stole my past. She doesn't get to steal my future too.